major research paper is worth worth 25% of your marks. There are no tutorial readings for next week, as you may have noticed. What we're going to do instead is your TA will be conducting a workshop on how to write effective research papers. Last year, our students found this very, very useful, and it had a positive impact on their grade, so I imagine you will as well. The map for the study of the in-class midterm, part of the in-class midterm is a map quiz. That's also been posted on Blackboard. You can use it as a study guide. The countries, the rivers, the cities that you should be able to place on the map are included in the syllabus. And I'll talk about the in-class midterm either on Thursday or early next week, the types of questions that you can expect, and what certain segments of the midterm will be made up of and how much they'll be worth. Finally, a reminder that our next film forum is tomorrow night, so Wednesday evening in Media Commons at 7 p.m. This time, it's a film about the Spanish Civil War, which we talk about next week, so this will give you a little bit of a heads up or a head start on that topic. It's called I, Carmela, and as you'd expect, it's from Spain. It's based on a play, and it's about a couple, and they're theater performers, and they're Republicans. So they're on the Republican side. By accident, they happen to cross over into rebel or fascist territory, and so their lives are in danger. They fear that they're going to be executed, but one of the fascist commanders is a fan of the theater. So he asks them to stage a burlesque performance at the expense of the Republic, so poking fun at the Republic. And if they do this, they'll win their freedom. It is a serious topic, but of course is addressed through comedy as well. And our head TA staff will provide the introduction for you. The next few lectures, we're going to continue on discussing the 1920s and the 1930s. So the two decades prior to the Second World War. And as we did last week with Italy, we're going to talk in more detail about specific countries to highlight the important topics and themes of the course. So in particular, over the next couple of weeks, we'll be looking a lot at Germany, Stalin, the Soviet Union under Stalin, Spain, and a little bit about France. At the end of the First World War, Thomas Masaryk, the first president of the newly created Czechoslovak Republic, described Europe as a laboratory atop a vast graveyard. This is the theme of our talk today, and it's a useful way to think about the impact of the Great War on European culture and on politics in particular. The war, of course, brought home enormous possibilities, but also uncertainties. And it's easy to collapse the two world wars and see the period, the 20s and 30s, only as interwar years. To see them as a prelude to the rise of Nazism or World War II. But even the term interwar suggests that Europeans are just sort of waiting for another conflict. One of the important things we're going to talk about today is that conflict wasn't inevitable, and World War II wasn't predetermined. In the wake of the destruction of the Great War and the collapse of the old empires, Europeans undertook some exciting political, social, and cultural experiments, the results of which are mixed. Of course, from the last two lectures, we looked at two specific outcomes: Russian Revolution in 1917, and the establishment of the first communist state, the Soviet Union, and Italy, the first fascist state under Mussolini. Neither one was clearly democratic, but both involved the mass mobilization of people and politics. And this led to new possibilities all over Europe. So if you think about Russia, here's where the concept of laboratories and graveyard fits. The death tolls in Russia of the war, the Civil War, the repression in the Soviet Union are the graveyard. But Zamyatin expressed also a sense of laboratory. in his futuristic dystopian novel that you're discussing this week in tutorials. There you also have the stench of death, but it's more the brutal repressive state, the death of ideals, the death of imagination, the death of sort of solidarity and freedom. But the idea of a laboratory doesn't only have to be negative. There are also some sort of hopeful endeavors that came out of the war. Today we're going to turn our attention to East Central Europe and to Germany, so the successor states of the Habsburg Empire, in particular Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, as a way of looking at the possibility of creating something new, and the way that this didn't come through as planned. We're going to start, as you can see, with a clip from probably the most famous film of the post-war period, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Has anyone seen it? A few people. Okay, great. This is directed by a German, Robert Wiener, and it's produced in Germany, but you can't really categorize it simply as a German film. Actually, it's the brainchild of two writers, a Czech poet and an Austrian screenwriter. And both were deeply influenced by their experience of World War I and the desire to create an anti-war message. The film is often referred to as the first horror film. So the plot synopsis is basically there's a scientist, Dr. Caligari. He has a sleepwalker called Caesar, whom he puts into a trance and he uses to kill people. So he controls his movements. The protagonist, Felix, tracks down Caligari after his sleepwalker kills Felix's best friend and kidnaps his girlfriend. And Felix finds out that Dr. Caligari is in a mental hospital, but he's not the inmate, he's actually the director. So the idea of the film was that evil is pulling the strings in society. This was supposed to be the original ending, but producers actually forced a framework, another ending, where Felix himself is delusional, and he's in a mental asylum. And Caligari is the doctor, and he says that he can cure Felix. Despite the alternative ending, overall the film is a very pessimistic view. It's about absolute pessimism in society. It was released in 1920, and it depicts precisely the type of cultural experimentation and cultural form that we talked about, that we referred to, or that is referred to as expressionism. You'll see with the sets, everything is tilted and angled to create this feeling of a world out of joint. The post-war period into the 1920s was a period of productivity in film and other forms of culture. And it really fits our theme today, experimentation with underlying death. It's evident here, you've got the cultural innovation, yet the film can also be read as a political allegory, or even political innovation, which we'll discuss. And Meyer, one of the writers, was actually a pacifist. So we're going to watch about a 5 to 6 minute clip. I should mention the clip is just going to start where he's introducing his sleepwalker. Caligari is introducing Caesar at a fair. hopefully you got a chance to see sort of some of the set design is what I find particularly compelling about the film. Okay, so we're going to turn to the peace settlements today, which we have discussed, but only very briefly. And it's important to delve into a little bit more detail with regard to the post-war peace treaties, because they are, particularly the Treaty of Versailles, one of the most misunderstood aspects of 20th century European history. They're blamed for everything. The Treaty of Versailles, in particular, is blamed for the rise of Hitler, to the Holocaust, to the Cold War. But what I want to sort of demonstrate today is that what happened after the war was in fact an attempt or an effort to create something new that had some very significant and even positive results. So our framework, Laboratory on Top of Graveyard, invites reconsideration of the post-war treaties as well. Paris Peace Conference, of course, peacemakers tried to show the possibility for real political innovations in the wake of this war. And it was a process that was definitely haunted by the dead, but it was not doomed to failure. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't perfect, but it was done with goodwill. The League of Nations itself is an example of political innovation. This was to be a meeting place for the countries of the world to ensure that war would not break out again, so that countries could settle things diplomatically. We know this was Wilson's main focus. The French, on the other hand, were concerned about national security, and along with the British, wanted Germany to pay reparations for French lives and for French property. As we discussed the shape post-war Europe took, it's important to know that the destruction of infrastructure in Germany was absolutely minimal compared to the destruction in other parts of Europe, the Western Front, France and Belgium. So, for being forced to compromise, the powers produced a series of treaties. The Treaty of Versailles, the most famous, was handed to the Germans in June 1919. And while it is true that Germany wasn't present to negotiate the treaty, neither were the other defeated nations, Turkey, Austria, Bulgaria. The Treaty of Versailles is often described as a punitive peace, but it needs to be looked at in the context of this experimentation and the fact that experimentation could be undermined by the bitter legacies of war. And of course, as we discussed last week, the Germans forced a much, much harsher treaty on the Russians with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And I gave you particulars on both treaties. In place of the old empires, new countries were created on the principle of national self-determination, but they often endorsed changes that had already been sort of made by populations during the war. This redrawing of boundaries made nationalities, in theory, the basis for the new order. There was also the commitment to building democracies in Europe. The idea that the Poles should have their own state with a representative government where they might govern themselves. In the same way, Czechs, Germans, and Hungarians should have their own state and liberal democracies. And these ideas would rule after the war, although they didn't always come to fruition. The creation of Poland included some parts of Eastern Germany, as well as what was called the Polish Corridor. So the new post-war Germany actually had two parts, the German Republic and East Prussia. And this was separated by Poland. And Germans described it as a rip through a human breast. So if you see here, you've got Germany and East Prussia, Poland here, This is the Polish corridor that leads to Danzig, which would give Poland a route to the city. The Polish corridor became a useful platform for criticism. Along with this establishment of Poland, in the Treaty of Versailles, there was Article 231, which is often referred to as the guilt clause, the war guilt clause. That's not really what it was. It was actually simply the first section of the treaty on war reparations. It was actually drafted by an American lawyer, and the fact that it didn't even actually say how much Germany had to pay shows that it was a placeholder in the treaty. By accepting the treaty, the Germans agreed that they were responsible for paying not an overall war indemnity, one like they'd forced on France for the Franco-Prussian War, but rather they were only to pay for the damages caused by the war. So it meant that they were to pay for the damages, but it didn't mean that they were morally responsible for the war. A similar clause appeared in all of the other treaties as well. The difference was that no one expected the other countries, like Turkey or Bulgaria, to pay, because these countries didn't have the resources or large economies to be able to do so. Germany did. Nevertheless, Article 231 became a very potent symbol for Germans whose perception of the war was that they hadn't really lost. They forced Russia to sign a treaty, and didn't the war end when German troops were far from home? In addition, given the high rate of casualties that Germany suffered as well, it felt like a terrible responsibility to be charged with the death and destruction. So this point became a rallying point for the resentment against the post-war settlements and also against the new German Republic. And it's an important reminder that sometimes perception plays a more important part in history than, so to say, the actual facts do. Perception creates its own force field, and that's what happened after World War I. But all of these treaties were experimentation in what to create next, and some things were quite innovative. If you look at Wilson, his League of Nations, you get an important understanding of how international relations might work. The League was to be the guarantor of peaceful relations between nations, but also the resolution of conflicts among different groups within nations. Because the principle of national self-determination, it sounded good to many people, but the world was not neatly divided, of course, along ethnic lines. Italians and Poles didn't find themselves neatly located in places where you could simply just draw a border. So, one of the legacies of the multinational empires that had collapsed was a massive, massive dispersion of populations. The notion of clear-cut borders was politically useful, but it was elusive. So, the successor states, the new states that formed out of the collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, for instance, had very mixed populations. In another attempt to innovate, the League of Nations created a system to sort of guarantee minority rights in these new countries. Each of the new states was required to sign a minority rights treaty in which they planned to recognize, quote, the full and complete protection of life and liberty of all inhabitants without distinction of birth, nationality, language, or religion. So the League was to be the guarantor of these minorities' rights individually and also collectively. And this alone was actually quite progressive. It was a vision of a new world and a coexistence where you had, for instance, Germans, Jews, Slovaks, and Czechs all existing in a new country called Czechoslovakia, whose government was obligated to protect their rights. These rights were also given concrete expression. Minorities were allowed to have their own schools, religious practices were to be respected, and so forth. The League was also a body to which complaints could be submitted, so it was to be the arbiter of conflicts. We remember Haile Selassie's speech to the League of Nations about Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. So there was an idea, if not reality, long before the United Nations, that it would be possible for countries of the world to work together to try to prevent war. So it was really about possibilities and hope. However, all of these things met with enormous opposition for many, many different reasons. Despite what we think about the Treaty of Versailles, Germany emerged from World War I in quite a strong position. Some historians have even argued that their position was stronger than before. If you think of one simple fact about Germany, in 1914, the country was bordered by the Russian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and a very strong France. After 1918, this was no longer the case. A weakened